I don't want to waste your time today, so there won't be an intro.
Hi, my name is Rogue Theory, and I've studied film, creative writing, game design, and transitive storytelling for the past 3 years. And this is Noble Knights, a Rogue Theory. Most people don't equate trading card games with storytelling. They might think that it is competitive or strategic, but card games can tell deeply rich stories that you don't simply watch unfold like a movie, or play like a scripted video game, but one where you yourself act as the narrator, trying to tell the deck's story as your opponent acts as the foil and/or attempts to stop you. However, unlike any other medium of storytelling, there's always a risk of defeat, a chance that the story you're telling goes either unfinished or ends with your opponent's victory. Now, some people will disagree with what I've said. They will counter that card games don't have the structure for storytelling, that there's no possible way to tell a story from a random set of cards drawn from a deck. My response is that 25% of all Americans believe in tarot cards. And unlike tarot, where you divine your future from a set of 3 random cards, this doesn't require you to believe in anything. It simply asks that you watch and listen as I tell you the story of King Artorigus and the Noble Knights. The Noble Knights consist of 2 sub-archetypes, those inspired from the Arthurian legends rewritten by the French in the 13th century, and those inspired from the Charlemagne cycle, specifically the major characters in the Song of Roland, penned in the 11th century. The Noble Knights consist of 23 monsters, 14 main deck Noble Knights, 4 extra deck Noble Knights, and 5 supporting non-Noble Knight monsters. They also have 10 spell cards comprised of 6 equipped spells, 2 normal spells, 1 quick play spell, and 1 field spell. And finally, they have 2 trap cards. For those of you who weren't keeping track, that's 35 cards dedicated to the legend of King Arthur. Now, seeing as we have a lot to go over, there's a few things you should know. First, I will be going over the cards chronologically in the timeline of the Legend of King Arthur, rather than the standard monster spell trap lineup for the Rogue Theory series. Second, this is not simply a lore video, as I will be discussing how the story gets translated into card effects and which cards are necessary for the deck to be playable at the end. Third, I reached out to Kaname when I was making this video, but instead of getting clarifying answers like whether or not Morgan Le Fay was King Arthur's half-sister, or comments on the extramarital relationships Guinevere has, I instead got the generic customer service response that they could not help me and I would have to do my own research. Fourth and finally, this is not your Disney The Sword and the Stone. The story has been rewritten dozens of times by numerous authors, each new author having added their own twists to the story. The TCG-inspired cards do not stray from this tradition, as Konami themselves have taken the liberty to write 2 articles that give us an insight into their twists to the world and the legend of King Arthur. As it doesn't go over the beginning, it is only fitting that in this retelling, I too shall add to the story of the Noble Knights, by laying the foundation for how the story unfolds. King Uther Pendragon is at war with the Saxons and casually at war with Glorys, the Duke of Cornwall, as he desires Glorys' wife, Igerna, for himself. Uther, in one of his many battles, captures a Celtic sorcerer who goes by the name of Merlin. Now, Uther Pendragon was a Christian king whose duty was to protect his people from the Saxon invaders and pagan worship, so it comes as no surprise that Uther tortures Merlin relentlessly to discover what he had been doing with the Saxons. However, Merlin insists that he was there to meet the king who would unite all of Britain. Uther believes this person to be himself and starts to believe in pagan worship. But as he is currently at war with the Saxons and Glorys, he can't really focus on defeating all the warlords of Britain. One night, Uther summons Merlin for advice on how to defeat Glorys so that he can get on with conquering the country. Merlin suggests shapeshifting Uther into Glorys as a disguise so Uther can infiltrate the enemy's castle and sleep with Igerna. Uther is 100% on board, so he strikes a deal with Merlin, who transforms Uther into Glorys on the condition that his firstborn son will be taken by Merlin. Uther bangs another dude's wife, kills the Duke of Cornwall, and takes Igerna as his own. Since Igerna is in mourning, she and Uther don't sleep together for a few weeks. Later, it's found out that she's pregnant, and to Igerna's perspective, it's Glorys' son, not Uther's. So when Igerna gives birth to Artorigus, she understands why her husband gives away the child to Merlin, and is at least happy that the baby is allowed to live. Merlin deposits the baby with a lower-level lord in the countryside, who is to raise Artorigus, teaching and training him until the day Merlin returns. A year goes by, and Uther and Igerna give birth to a girl named Morgan. Morgan eventually will conceive a child herself, known as Madrant. Madrant is raised to believe he will inherit the throne, as Morgan is declared unfit to rule, having conceived a child outside of wedlock. Uther and Igerna die, having been poisoned by the Saxons. Merlin attempts to reach Uther in time, but instead makes it just in time for Uther to sign a royal decree stating that as he has no legitimate heir, whoever can pull Excalibur from the stone will be his true heir, and the king to unite all of Britain. Years pass and no one can pull the sword from the stone. It is then, when the land is in utter chaos, does Merlin return to find Artorigus. With some convincing, Artorigus learns of his royal bloodline and is motivated to pull Excalibur from the stone. Okay, now that we've finally come this far, we can go over some brief facts. Merlin's first ability that attributes himself from the field represents the uncanny habit he has in the story of appearing briefly in and out, while the special summoning of noble knights from the deck represents the fact that he set up everything for Artorigus' return. Yes, even the legendary sword in the stone was devised by him. For proof, it's hinted in Artorigus' flavor text. No one shall ever know the truth behind that fateful day. Artorigus went forth to wear the brilliant sword dislay. 'Twas the first of many feats so great, a legend through and through. We sing of him, Artorigus, the noble and the brave, from the tales of the noble knights. Now, did you catch that? Here, let me give you a hint. Was that too fast for you? Okay, so now you are probably wondering what I mean by Merlin is the narrator. Well, Kaname decided to make the story self-aware that it was a story, as you can see with the last line of this card being from the Tales of the Noble Knights.
Any shoutouts?
Yeah, I'd like to shout out the last chapter of the Noble Knights for being the last chapter. On a serious note, what this implies is that Merlin knows something that no one else knows, the truth in how Artorigus could pull the sword, because centuries ago he planted it there in the stone, like the other swords, to be pulled by King Artorigus and his noble knights. This is represented in Merlin's second and third effect that allow him to be banished from the graveyard to quick synchro or quick XYZ summon out the boss monsters of the deck. Back to the story, Artorigus gathers knights across the land and becomes King Artorigus. He then establishes the Kingdom of Camelot and the Knights of the Round Table, and goes off to war against the Saxons and on adventures to unite the land and the people of Britain. The effects of the Knights of the Round Table symbolize the countless adventures the original knights go on that lead to a lack of successes and many failures. The first being the ineffective journey they take, the second being the eventual success of Lancelot, Gawain, and Galvachad, who pull swords from the stone, the third being the rescue missions and attempts to complete the quest for the Holy Grail, and the fourth being really a Hail Mary, as they only have 14 different main deck noble knights. In between the completion of the noble knights and their quest for the remaining legendary swords, Artorigus marries Guinevere. Guinevere is considered a noble arms and can be equipped from the hand as she represents making the knights she's attached to stronger. Now at Artorigus' wedding, he finally meets the Lady of the Lake, a half-fae water nymph for the first time. King Artorigus learns she was invited because she is the mother of Lancelot, meaning Lancelot is part fae. This explains why Guinevere, and so many other women, and even some men, have an irresistible desire to be with Lancelot. Now before this point, Lancelot hadn't desired anyone, but for some reason Guinevere does the trick. Perhaps it's because of her beauty, or the fact that this archetype is a sausage fest, or that she represents forbidden desire, but many of the knights begin to lust after her. Lancelot does this immediately, as noted by how he is already considered a dark attribute. Now, all the knights who lust after her are Madrat, Pajur, Bors, and Lancelot, all of whom which Guinevere actively has extramarital affairs with. This is noted in two ways, the first being Guinevere gives bonus effects to light or dark attribute-based noble knights, and the second being that Madrat, Pajor, and Bors gain additional effects when equipped with Guinevere, becoming dark attribute and gaining a level so that they cannot be used for the XYZ summon of King Artorigus. During the events of all the affairs, Lancelot on one of his many quests sleeps with Guinevere. But wait, it was actually a woman who was disguised herself as Guinevere, because Lancelot refused to sleep with her after rescuing her. So she decided to disguise herself because she thought Lancelot would be forced to realize he is only infatuated with the idea of Guinevere, not actually in love with her. However, despite his revelation, he decides he is unworthy of Guinevere's love until he retrieves one of the legendary swords. Well, in his long journey away, it turns out that not only was Guinevere Netflixing and chilling with the other noble knights, but the woman who disguised herself that he had slept with gave birth to the knight that would eventually be known as Galvachad. Now, a lot of time passes before the next events in the storyline, Glory of the Noble Knights, which shows King Artorigus welcoming Galvachad into the noble knights from a first-person perspective. Note the distinct lack of other knights. Well, right around the time Galvachad gets knighted, Bors finds the Holy Grail and gives it to King Artorigus. With the Grail, King Artorigus becomes the Sacred Knight through Deus Vult.
We will take Jerusalem!
and he believes with it he can conquer the Holy Roman Empire as his next big step for Britain, having just defeated the Saxons. King Artorigus, before going off to start the Crusades and fight the Holy Roman Empire, he is told to retrieve Excalibur from the Lady of the Lake by Merlin to aid Artorigus in his quest. Of course, like all other blades, Merlin commissioned the Lady of the Lake to make the blade long ago for Britain's true and only son. The Lady of the Lake, however, splits the blade into two halves, one red and one blue, and gives the blue blade to King Artorigus as she believes her son to be the only true son of Britain. With this blade, King Artorigus finally becomes a sacred knight in his artwork and goes off to fight the Holy Roman Empire.
Nani.
Yeah.
Look.
But when King Artorigus goes off to fight the Holy Roman Empire, Medrawt overthrows Camelot and marries his aunt Guinevere when he's away. Lancelin finally recovers a sword that cannot be named and goes to Medrawt to save Guinevere from what he assumes is an unwanted marriage and to preserve Artorigus' honor. Also, maybe so he can get some goodnight kisses from his crush. Well, when Lancelin arrives at Camelot, Medrawt tells him that Guinevere married him willingly, but he is willing to give her to Lancelin if he agrees to help him kill Artorigus, who will return to reclaim his throne and his wife. Lancelin agrees. He is then told by Guinevere of Artorigus' new sword, Excalibur, so Lancelin decides he needs a second magical sword to defeat Artorigus. Lancelin finally returns to his birthplace to find his mother and ask that she bestow him a blade of equal power. The Lady of the Lake gives him the red copy of the sword and prays for her and Merlin's son's well-being. Artorigus finally hears about what's going on back home and pulls his troops out of modern-day Europe at the time, and then returns home to defeat Medrawt. Medrawt and his knights get dispatched by Artorigus' still loyal knights, though only 3 survive: Guinevere, Ector, and Custennin. Finally, Artorigus and Lancelin square off. Artorigus manages to kill Lancelin, but is gravely wounded in the process. Guinevere manages to get the knights to carry Artorigus back to Camelot, where they tend to his wounds, but the sinful lust and jealousy that Lancelin had infected the magic of his own blade, poisoning Artorigus. Guinevere finally sees the consequences of her own actions and calls Merlin to help fix Artorigus' condition. Artorigus, believing himself to be dying, asks that Guinevere returns Excalibur to the lake as he is not fit to wield the sword. But as we know, in truth, he wasn't given the whole blade. Guinevere agrees to carry the remnants of Excalibur to the lake, including the version Lancelin used. Merlin arrives shortly after being called by Guinevere. He then tells her there isn't much time, and the sword that was just sent away will be the only thing to return Artorigus' life, but only if they bring him to the island of Avalon to be healed, for only true love can return him to life on the island in which life was created. Thus, Guinevere rides out chasing after Guinevere to fix her selfish mistakes, thinking herself to be true love with King Artorigus. To not receive any foolish comments down below, I will be reading directly from the Kaname article which detail Guinevere's thoughts during this whole part of the storyline. As she stood beside the backwards man, 2 tears raced down her cheek. Artorigus lay upon the bed, eyes closed and breathing weak. It's a miracle at all he lives, mused Merlin at wit's end. His body fights the poison hard, but time is not his friend. The old man doffed his beaten hat, sweat beating at his brow, and Guinevere's mouth twisted sad. She spoke but one word, how. We won him time in coming here, but he may have gone too far. The only thing twixt him's and death's, this place, this Avalon. What evil spilled out from a draught, infected and betrayed, his blood became a poison, and it smeared the traitor's blade. And now it courses our king's veins, and I've no cure in mind. The magic of this place is all, keeps death one step behind. The word stung deep in Guinevere, the traitor, know his name. The man whom she'd felt in her heart was not in whole to blame. For while Lancelin lifted sword and had struck down his king, his heart was always true to him, except in but one thing. Would he perchance been strong enough? Could he have fought the blood? If his heart had simply remained pure, not clouded as with mud. She fought a tightening in her throat, a guilt she'd not confined. The traitor stood here in the room, it burned her cold inside. But Gwen's heart hardened then and there. She clenched her tiny hand, she turned to Merlin, straight and tall, and made her soft demand. My king yet breathes, O wizard. I know something keeps him here. I won't accept death's sentence now. You'll help me interfere. Merlin sighed and nodded. Once again he doffed his hat and dabbed his brow. I'd hope, my dear, that you'd not ask me that. It's true, for him there may be hope. Fate's plan may yet be swerved, but the cost and risk are high in this. Some trials aren't deserved. Gwen nodded firmly, set her jaw, and boldly raised her chin. I'll do whatever I can do, whatever might save him. The backwards man could look ahead but couldn't see the past. He didn't know that Gwen would fight until she breathed her last. For love and guilt spun in her heart and wove a feeling strong. Guinevere do anything she could do to right her wrong. Then there's no time to be wasted. If there's hope, it lies in luck. By the graces in this fortunate isle, a deal may be struck. I bid you seek Excalibur. We need the sword again. Its magic's might yet save our king. Rush to Nim's fen. I never should have tarried, and now my precious minutes lack. Get the sword by sundown, and my spells can bring you back. But remember this, dear Guinevere, eyes narrowed, Merlin spoke. No promise made on Avalon may ever but be broke. I vow it now, the queen replied, voice pausing, not a breath. If the island wants to test my heart, I'll save our king from death. Guinevere arrives at the lake first, but decides to leave with the sword rather than returning it. Each time he does so, he finds himself back at the center of the forest as if the Lady of the Lake refuses for him to go. Finally, he tosses the blade in, and the Lady of the Lake thanks him. On his journey out, he notices Merlin and complains to him. Merlin thinks to warn him of the ambush that awaits him, but thinks it to be futile, as we discover in this Kaname article that Merlin experiences time in the same way that Dr. Manhattan does. He cannot change his future because it's already happening, and has happened to him in the past. In the beginning, I saw the end. On the shore of a lake, in the heart of the wood, I saw a man, clad in armor with a cape as red as blood. This was the man who knew war, and now he knew peace. A man with a red blade had stalked him to this place, and struck him down before himself departing, but not before the Caped Knight had discharged his final duty. I am Guinevere, friend of Artorigus, he bellowed, and I believe this belongs to you. He had been carrying a peculiar sword, wrapped in cloth. The sword was unlike any other, with two blades extending from its golden hilt. The wrapped and broken blades made it clear that this sword had seen its final battle. Guinevere, having made his proclamation, cast the sword into the lake, but as the blade neared the water surface, it suddenly stopped. Where once was open air, there now is a beautiful woman, cradling the sword in her arms as if it were a child. The woman now descended slowly into the lake, and as she did, an unearthly voice rang out, "Thy task is done." I met the man Guinevere at the edge of the forest, alive and well, his tired eyes filled with a fury at the sight of me. You provided sage counsel so many times throughout his life. You could have warned him. You should have warned him. Guinevere's voice trailed off as his rage was replaced by sadness. This man had lost a friend. Artorigus, was it? Not just a man or a friend, but a king, Guinevere explained. Artorigus had summoned Guinevere and assigned him one final task before breathing his last, to lay the sword Excalibur to rest in the lake at the center of the woods, a task he had failed twice thus far. I remained silent. Guinevere spoke again. There's no escaping this, is there? Every time I try to leave, I wind up back in front of the forest. I considered warning him of the lakeside ambush, but realized it would do no good. What was to be would always be, for it had already been. Take care of yourself, Guinevere, I said, and at that, he ventured into the woods. As you can see from how that article is structured and the way that it tells the story, Merlin experiences time as each moment the present, the same as how Dr. Manhattan does in Watchmen. However, like Dr. Manhattan, Merlin also has the same weaknesses. He is not omniscient. He can only possibly change what he perceives to be the future by being absent of the present. And by doing so, he leaves at this point not to be ever seen again throughout the story. Finally, the man who kills Guinevere by the lake is Ector, possessed by Lancelin's ghost, who dies himself after the task is complete. Guinevere pleads with the Lady of the Lake as seen in her artwork and retrieves both her and Excalibur from the lake and brings them to Avalon where they look after him, hoping he can be saved, but Merlin is not in sight. Well, with the power of Excalibur and Caliburn, they draw Morgan from her tower on the island. She then uses her powers and extracts the magic from Excalibur to negate the poison and allow Artorias to live, but only for the span of a month. For the only love that exists on Avalon when he visits is that of a brother and sister who have just met for the first time. Artorias returns to Camelot and crowns his last and remaining noble knight Custon as the king, and with the power of the Grail makes him the sacred noble knight. You can see in the background Guinevere is worried about what place she will take in this new kingdom without anyone left to manipulate. Finally, Artorias returns to the island of Avalon and plants his sword Caliburn into a stone on Avalon, placing his memories, experiences, and his soul into the sword, so that whoever pulls the sword in the stone in England's time of need can have the strength to unite and save Britain once again. Now that you understand the lore of the Noble Knights, we can finally establish why certain effects belong to certain knights. While I didn't go over each unique knight's quest and their own unique stories that get translated into their monster effects and card artwork like Yvain, I will make a video in the future about those knights and the storylines I skipped over if this video gets 100 likes. Noble Knight Artorias doesn't have any effects or significant stats because just like in the story, he doesn't do anything important until he gets one of the legendary swords, which is why you don't play this in the main deck as it represents him pulling a legendary sword, but not actually having it at that moment. Noble Knight Gawain was mandatory in old format Noble Knights because he was essential to get 2 monsters on the field turn 1 to make your XYZ plays. Despite what many people would think, this card is still playable, though only at 1 or 2 copies in a pure variant, as the deck doesn't need to rely on this extender to make their own boss monsters anymore. Noble Knight Madrat, be it Irony or Poetic Justice, is a mandatory 3-of in the deck, as summoning a Noble Knight from the deck is extremely strong, and the fact that he can destroy a Noble Arms equipped to him to become a level 4 again for an XYZ summon after special summoning a knight from the deck is extremely rewarding. Noble Knight Bors is just a pad power tool dragon. The fact that you need him to be equipped with a Noble Arms to use the effect is too much of a drawback to consider using him in the main deck. And in the fact that you can use his effect, he also becomes a level 5, so you can't use him for the XYZ summon out of an important boss monster. In old formats before we got a sold Tales of the Noble Knight, this card was ran partially for its effect and partially because it was a normal monster for Gawain. Noble Knight Dristan provides protection like Spiral Resort to all your combo pieces while he's on the field. His second effect, however, lets you pop off by popping a card your opponent controls, though this doesn't come up often. If you combine this with Glory of the Noble Knights, you can interrupt your opponent's plays on their turn. Or if you summon this card off of Madrat, since all Noble Arms re-equip after being destroyed, you can then pop a card on his summon because it'll re-equip to him. Noble Knight Galvachad, or Chad as I like to call him, is a useful piece of recursion in pure Noble Knight plays, where you can add back your extender like Noble Knight Gawain, though in competitive builds he's not played at all. Noble Knight Perdue is bad, just don't play him. Noble Knights Brothers is one of the best Noble Knights because it gets extra copies out of your hand and lets you cycle back resources to draw. In pure and most combo variants, he's a mandatory 3-of. Noble Knight Hector is a possible and capable extender that lets you set up your boss monsters without fear, but won't save them in the long run, therefore this card is a simple 1-of or none-of. Noble Knight Guinevere can be important for setting up graveyard dumping before a sold. Post a sold, this isn't worth running in the main deck as he's mainly a story-based card. Noble Knight Pellinor is a better on-your-turn version of Noble Knight Dristan. However, as the deck often lacks extenders, oddly enough, you would rather have Dristan for the interruption than Pellinor for the draw. Noble Knight Custon acts as one of the rare extenders in this deck that previously it was missing for a long time. The fact that you can grab yourself an extra normal summon in a deck that lacks special summoning is extremely key for the strategy to play out, and the fact that it summons itself means opening a Noble Arms without a Madrat isn't always a brick. Noble Knight Yvain is another key example of great legacy support. While it isn't a Noble Knight Custonin, the fact that it gives you another way to access a sold is all that really matters in a deck filled with normal summons looking to get their extenders. And finally, Ignoble Knight of Black Lasallen. Oh my god, where to start with this card? It's chock full of lore-based effects, and while that's really cool, he doesn't do anything for the Noble Knights. Symbolic irony is not intended. If this card didn't replace a Noble Knight on the field and instead summoned himself to help a Noble Knight, this card would be played at 3, but it doesn't, so don't play this card, please. A sold 2 Tales of the Noble Knights is one of the extenders that makes this deck truly functionable. Since she can be summoned with any 2 warriors, this lets a Soul assist the deck by allowing it to run generic combo extenders outside of their own archetype to turbo her out, and while she dumps your Noble Arms to the graveyard to summon out a warrior from your deck. This lets you both fulfill combo plays and set up your graveyard for King Artorigus. Artorigus, King of the Noble Knights, gives the deck the ability to wipe back row like Harvey's Feather Duster. Sacred Noble Knight of King Artorigus is the rank-up version of his previous form, made through the effect of Excalibur. His extra strength, pop effect, and ability to float make him the key boss monster for the deck. Sacred Noble Knight of King Custonin lets you bounce cards, then quickly float up into the Sacred Knight form of Artorigus, which in turn can pop cards and then float down into impactful monsters like Noble Knight Brothers. Ignoble Knight of High Lancelin would have been considered playable if the deck had ways to find easy access to level 1 tuners and if they still relied on equipping Noble Arms like they did in slower formats. Guinevere, Queen of the Noble Arms, fluctuates anywhere between 3 to 1 depending on the format of the deck's in. However, in almost all cases, she provides competent protection for your monsters, so at the least, she's worth running a copy of in your deck. Lady of the Lake suffers from not being a warrior, a Noble Knight, or Noble Arms. As such, there is no effective way to utilize this card outside of looping it like a level eater for link plays. Morgan, the Enchantress of Avalon, lets the deck finally have a competitive edge outside of big boss monsters that grind out your opponent's resources, by providing a way to negate cards with little cost, as all Noble Arms re-equip when destroyed. To me, she's the ideal marriage of story meeting effectiveness in card form. Merlin is by far the strongest supporting card for the archetype, as it lets you lone fire out knights and quick XYZ to dodge any annoying targeting effects like Eldritch. However, as now that we have a Soul, Merlin is not necessarily played as much because you can fit in warrior extender combos to substitute Merlin's original starter combo plays. Noble Knights of the Round Table is a poorly designed card. If it didn't have to have a certain graveyard requirements for its effects, and instead worked like either Dragon's Ravine or Dragonic Diagram, this card would have seen immediate play. Last chapter of the Noble Knights, while this card's effect acts as a better version of Monster Reborn, its inability to be used turn 1, and its restrictions on how it can be used, make this card more of a Saki 1 of in a deck that can't win games using that card alone. Noble Arms Caliburn gives you life points and makes your monsters big. Noble Arms Clarant lets you attack directly, and while Caliburn represents the birth of an era, Clarant is supposed to be its counterpart, making you pay 500 rather than gaining 500, representing the downfall of the Noble Knights. Noble Arms of Destiny prevents destruction of your Noble Knights. Though it doesn't follow the previous naming conventions, this is probably because it might be a reference to the Sword of Mars, previously carried by Attila the Hun. Noble Arms Gallatin makes your monsters super big, but they lose attack each standby phase. However, since you are constantly switching the owner of the blade, you'll find the attack loss to be manageable and not problematic. Noble Arms that I cannot name is a mandatory tech piece, as having an in-theme support option for spell and trap removal is always worth running. So, play 1. Noble Arms Excalibur is one of the best Noble Arms. Making your monsters untargetable is one of the strongest forms of protection. After all, look at Avramax. However, add in the ability to rank up or rank down, and you can see why this archetype still has the versatility to be competitive in the current metagame. Until Noble Arms are needed once again is up there with Assault in terms of effectiveness and power, as it lets you excavate cards from the top of your deck and choose one of them to add to your hand, be it an Ash Blossom, an Infinite Impermanence, or another Noble Knight or Noble Arms. It's super impactful and important. The other fact is that you can banish this card from your graveyard to special summon a Noble Knight that's not in your graveyard or on the field, is another reason why this card should be played at 3 or at 1 or 2 if you're playing boars. And now, finally, Avalon. Despite being a board wipe, it's too hard to pull off and it's too costly to use in the deck. That's about it. Now, before you go off and conquer Jerusalem and start the 10th Crusade, here's a list I've been playing around with. As you can see, this version focuses on a pure variant with minor lore focus. For competitive play, I suggest removing Merlin and swapping him out for warrior extender packages like Neo Space Connector and Aqua Dolphin, so you can find room for hand traps in the main deck as the Soul's consistency goes up, meaning you have room to run hand traps instead of knights. Now, while every other deck is a part of a bigger story, to Noble Knights, everyone you face is just an obstacle in your way for you to conquer Eldritch and the Golden Land. All this deck asks is that you take up arms and listen to Deus Vult.
There is no other choice. You must join Smash.
Huh?
Join Smash Brothers already! What in the world are you waiting for?
So joining Smash consumes even the darkness itself!
And as always, this is Rogue Theory, passing turn.